this event is closed to the media. So if you are part of the media, if you could jump off at this call, and we'll be available for interviews after. If we would also ask that you keep yourself on mute unless you're speaking, and if you have a question for the presenters at any time, please type them in the comment box or the chat box, and we will get to them throughout the presentation. There is new information every day about SBA loans and the PPP. To help us understand the potential legal concerns with these loans, paid leave, and the stay-at-home order, I would like to welcome Bill Woodward, John Eden, and Jim Macy from Von Briesen and Roper. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mickey. My name is Jim Macy, and as noted, I'm joined by a couple of my shareholder partners, John Iden and Bill Woodward. It's certainly our pleasure to be here today. It's certainly safe for us to say that in working on employment issues and business issues for many years, there's never been a time as challenging or as interesting, quite frankly, as we're working through it. Really proud of our team and our firm that spends a lot of time on this, trying to stay on top of all the, as mentioned, the daily changes that occur with this. And I'll note, even on the first page here of the outline, the website, and a thanks to Karen Bruno, our Director of Marketing, who keeps track of all the different articles and updates that we provide to you for free on our website. And I direct you to take a look at that on all of the different issues that are coming up on these kind of things. As we work through this program, you know, it seems to be so long ago, is under Wisconsin's safer at home order, you know, going back to March 24th, and to think that it's not all that long ago, but it really is, and how much things have changed since then for you and for everyone, not just in Wisconsin, but across the country. As we looked at the different safer at home orders, as we work with them in the different states, and the impacts they've had on the large businesses, the small businesses, the ability to travel, the ability to communicate, the ability to have meetings, to work on the kind of meeting that we're having today. It's all different kind of things that maybe we weren't so familiar with even as far back as March 24th. Then things got extended recently on April 16th. And what does that mean, and all the debate that's going on with that? And we want to talk to you about those type of things today. And then as the new benefits, the new rules come into play, what does that mean for you? And for some of you that have never been subject to the Family Medical and Leave Act because of the size, that now certain provisions that apply to you, and you've had to get up to speed quickly with those type of things and the different requests, and who does it apply to and who's exempt, those kind of issues that you're facing and challenging. Let's talk about some of those kind of things today. And as noted, you certainly can ask us questions as we're going through it. To what degree has your company stepped back and said, what is our plan for now getting back to work? And as we shift a little bit from the focus of saying, wait a minute, we've got to stop working, and how does that impact us? Does it impact us? Are we essential? Are we not essential? What's our relationship with our local police departments and communities as to what we're doing? How do we be safe for our customers and our employees? How are we going to reintroduce our employees back to the workplace now that some have been off? Or if some have been on and some have been off, how do we do that? How do we deal with an unemployment compensation scenario with $600 extra in work competitively in some of our industries and some of the service industries? The incentive to come back to work may not be there. Different issues we haven't addressed. All of a sudden you are faced with a pandemic policy. Do you have a policy? We'll talk about some of the things that may go with that. What are the different leave issues that you are facing for those that may qualify for leaves? Some where you may have new leaves you've never experienced before. And for those people that just say, you know what, I'm uncomfortable coming to work. I have a spouse who's in a difficult medical scenario, or I have limitations. Can I just stay home? Because I'm quite frankly scared about that. That aside, as we're looking ahead day to day, almost daily now with some of the businesses, what safety protocols I haven't talked to a business, none of our colleagues have talked to a business that say, we want to get back to work without having it being safe for our employees, safe for our customers, and doing the right things. That's what you want to be thinking about too, and that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more today. John, if I turn it to you.
So focusing on the reintroduction of employees, I think the first step that every employer needs to do is evaluate where you are currently. And that's a two-part analysis. One, at what level are you functioning currently from a staffing perspective? As Jim said, all industries have been affected in varying degrees. And when we start to reopen, we're going to see reopening happening at different levels with different industries as the definition of essential business, or however the state is going to be defining who can and cannot operate. That is going to be an evolving issue. And it isn't going to be June 1, everything is back open and everyone is permitted to operate at 100% capacity. We don't expect that. So in order to evaluate how to gradually ramp up your production and your operation, I think you need to evaluate what has been your productivity and your employment status as of now. And first looking at where, like I said, where are your employees? Have there been furloughs, meaning active employees who just aren't being scheduled for work? Have there been layoffs? Are those employees still interested and available to come back to work? Have you had full-time employees reduced to part-time? Do you have people working on-site or working from home? The ones who have been working from home, have they been productive? Do they have increased capacity, or are there limitations in their work environment at home that prevent them from taking on more responsibility? The answers to these questions and that internal review will help guide you when you see a gradual increase in demand for products, productivity, etc. If you see a 10% increase, can you shift that to the people that are currently employed in their current capacity? If you have a 25% increase, is there going to need to be employees recalled? Are employees who are currently operating from home but not operating at the level that they need to be, will they have to be brought back into the workplace? These are entirely fact-specific issues for each employer in each industry to identify. As Jim said, it's really unprecedented in the way that this issue has impacted employers. I think it's safe to say that no one in the practice of law, or really in any professional capacity, has seen an issue that has such a disparate impact from one group to the next. We talk to employers that have increased productivity and increased demand, and other industries that are completely shut down during this. So, like I said, it is entirely fact specific, but where you are now, what your capacity is and what your employees are doing will help guide those decisions as we start to see relaxed restrictions going forward into late May, early June, and throughout the summer. And like I said, you gather this data now because in a couple of weeks when we do see relaxed restrictions and then you are hearing from customers or clients about the increased demand, you know, for example, that this group of employees who are working from home have an additional capacity to work, and the increase can be shifted there without bringing in people back. When you are talking about bringing back furloughed employees or hiring new employees, bringing back laid off employees, you want to make sure that the decision-making process is ironed out ahead of time, that you've identified objective criteria for going through that analysis and deciding who comes back. You want to have that decision-making centralized as best as possible to avoid different decision makers, different department heads, managers, etc., using different criteria for who they recall. You certainly don't want to have a manager selecting the employees, the newest employees with the lowest wage rate. That'll likely have an age impact. You don't want to have managers saying, I'm not going to bring back this group of employees because they have young children and I know they're just going to ask for paid leave to provide childcare. I mean, these are not a legitimate, non-discriminatory basis for making your recall or rehire decision. So you want to make sure before the reopening happens in whatever way or to whatever extent it does, that you have that, you've gone through that exercise and you have that criteria outlined. And as Jim alluded to, you want to the extent you're talking about bringing back laid off or furloughed employees, you should be reaching out now or in the very near future to gauge interest and in anticipation of bringing employees back. You don't want to have a spike in demand and just expect that everyone who was previously laid off is interested in coming back, and then all of a sudden find out that only 25% of those employees are available. So that these are all things that you can do now, like I said, in anticipation of the reopening. And now the policies related to the pandemic and bringing employees back. Jim will talk about those.
Now it's time to take a little bit of step back and say, where are you? And if you had to do a little bit of an audit, a little bit of a checklist, let's talk about some things that ought to be either done in process or definitely looked at this point from your personnel standpoint. Let's talk about paid leave usage. As I said, some of us weren't covered by FMLA before, but now we are under certain aspects of it under the new federal law. You should have in place updated FMLA policies with updated FMLA request forms and approval denial forms, because there are new avenues for people to take those benefits or not. And you're going to want to have that documentation. You're going to want to have that documentation from a medical standpoint to the degree that medical information is going to be required to qualify for some of those benefits. But you're also going to want to have those documents in place, because you may be getting some money back down the road, and in an audit or other aspects of it, some of this paper trail is going to be really, really important for you. We may not have been as strict before on our attendance policies, but definitely time to revisit your attendance policy to see how is that working under these unique circumstances, and is your policy really as up to date as it should be in what you're requiring. Keep in mind there's going to be differences to that attendance policy now that there are other leave aspects available under federal law. So what may apply under your prior attendance scenarios may not be exactly the same anymore. And when you're thinking about the attendance and who's there and who's not there, what impact does that have on your policies? For example, assuming the federal law doesn't apply, assuming the other FMLA doesn't apply, what does your policy say if somebody's off of work for X amount of time, and how much longer do you pay the full premium of a health insurance benefit? As time goes on, hopefully things get better sooner than later. We all hope that, but what if not? We're certainly getting the questions to say somebody's been out, they're out of all of their leaves. At what point do they pay their insurance? And we say, what do you have in your policy? On your checklist, take a look at that. There are so many people working from remotely now and at home, more than we'd ever expect, and quite frankly, pretty efficiently to some degree, as we're talking to different employers about that. Do you have a policy in place that deals with that? How are you dealing with the wage and hour aspects of keeping track of those hours and making sure productivity is there? The good news is, so many of our employees are great, and that's not an issue at all. But again, for documentation later, for the chance that you may have some reimbursements coming, to the degree that you want to avoid wage and hour issues, you're going to want to make sure you've got a remote work rule up to date, or at least in place and then up to date. Changes in schedules, can't say I've ever seen anything quite like the changes in schedules that we're seeing all over the place. Who makes those changes? How is that decided? Who determines who's working when? If it's not in place, revisit that right now and get to it, because that's definitely going to be an issue as you're moving forward and putting people back into place, into the workplace. Many people have a COVID-19 team, response team as far as that goes. Who are your go-to people? Who are making those final decisions? If it's not in place, take a look at something like that. I never saw as much information about washing hands as I've ever seen, and all the other things that we can probably rattle off the top of our heads, but it gets updated quite regularly, all of the different hygiene practices and good practices, and you want to be up to speed with that and have that in place, and educating people about all of that, and even updated as, again, we reintroduce people back into the workplace. I don't know to the degree some of you, I know some of you have been faced with emergency closings, last minute scenarios, incidences in the workplace. Are we ready for that? And I'm not just talking about the governor's order about closing. What are you going to do if there's an emergency aspect? And what is our contingency planning dealing with all of these kind of things? We've already talked about the different pay and leave practices, but our HR departments clearly have had to adjust and determine how we're going to deal with and implement and educate our employees about the different pay and leave practices that go with it. How are we dealing with emergency medical procedures, those type of things, all things within at least your COVID-19 response aspect that you want to have up to speed as far as that goes. Again, if you look at a plan, if you look at the policy in addressing those kind of things, you're getting a lot of information. The health department, we can't go too far without getting more information about best practices, safe distance, social distancing, a whole new vocabulary that we didn't have even a couple months ago. But are you up to speed as to what those are? How many people can be in your workplace at one time or within a certain area? You may hear 10, you may hear none. But what are the best practices to avoid transmission and have that up to speed, educate employees about that? What are your rules about travel? The employee says, I'm driving, well, we can't stand it anymore being home. We're taking a drive and we're going to see our relatives in Minnesota. We can all question whether going up to see the Vikings area is a good idea or not, but now you're faced with a situation of what do I do if the health department is telling me people ought not drive, and can you then require them to be off of work for a period of time? And the answer is yes, you may do that, but you also may have a policy that advises people that if they do this, and if we're instructed that we can't have people back to work, they may not be back to work for a while, and they may not be eligible for pay depending on what your other policies say about that, and to the degree they figure into or not figure into some of the other benefits that are available. What do you do if an employee tests positive? God forbid you're going to have this situation. I know some of you have had this situation. You're going to notify health people, and we have to report some of these kind of things. But we get asked quite a bit to say, what's our responsibility to tell the rest of our workforce that Jim Macy tested positive for COVID-19? So far, we do not have the ability to disclose the names of individuals. You can disclose and should disclose that within certain work areas we had an issue, we had an exposure, or we had a positive test. And then we may have to work back into see who may have been exposed, working with health officials as how to address that kind of scenario. Think ahead and be ready with your policy and your plan as to what if somebody tests positive. And then what other considerations do we have in mind about offering alternative work environments, either remotely or other scenarios with everything else going on? It's a checklist to step back, take a look, and see where you are with those issues.
And one additional comment on the policy. These are the general topics that you want to address, and the policy itself will be general because the application is entirely fact specific. Travel out of the country is very different than travel to California, which is very different than travel to a Western state that has very low COVID population density. So it's impossible to draft a policy that outlines a step-by-step roadmap for how to deal with every single scenario. However, you do want to put employees on notice that travel could result in a requirement that you stay home, and there is an obligation to report exposure, and there is an obligation to report a positive case. What you do in response to that information, again, is fact specific, but you want to at least have a policy that puts the obligation on the employee. I think employers who don't have those policies run the risk of someone not sharing that information, bringing COVID into the workplace and saying that I was under no expectation or obligation to say anything, and I'm sorry, but now everyone in my workforce is sick. That employer, I think that employer would look bad, frankly, for not having taken these basic precautionary steps to manage the workforce. And while the policy topics may seem general, compared to the fact-specific scenarios that you're dealing with on a daily basis, it starts with the policy, and then the analysis and the administration is based on the facts.
And one other point, in connection with the policies themselves, getting out to the employees that the name of an individual who may test positive is something that cannot be disclosed is important, because if they don't know that ahead of time and you have a positive test result within your facility and you're going to close a place down for cleaning, and it seems like you're hiding something if you don't tell them ahead of time that we're not going to tell you who it was, we're going to give you limited information, please don't go out on social media then and blast the company for not indicating that employee A, who everybody knows who isn't there, is causing the problem. If it's ahead of time, if the employees know that your policy says, hey, we can't give out certain medical information, and it's going to be the same for you as it is for every other employee, then that addresses that negative impact in the social media realm. I had that issue with a client, and the next day, social media was just negative on the company because of this indication that they were hiding something, and they weren't hiding anything. They just couldn't disclose that it was an employee versus a vendor versus somebody else who came into their facility. They did the right thing. They shut down, they cleaned, they did everything right, but they still there were still some negative implications that they had to deal with. And I think that may have been because their employees, it was too early in the policy era to get something out. I know that right now, even the order itself requires employers to have a policy in place to prevent employees from coming in the door. So according to the order itself, you have to have a policy in place that does put the burden on the employer to find out if the employee has had any of the symptoms or has been in contact with somebody. And we've put together one of those, a simple policy that we'd be more than happy to give to the chamber and allow its members to use just as a starting point.
So shifting now to a discussion on leave issues. I know there are certainly some on the call here that have heard more than they ever want to hear about the Family First Coronavirus Response Act and the paid leave, emergency paid sick leave and expanded FMLA leave. Not everyone is up to speed. We're still getting questions on this daily, but it's also important to point out that this is a benefit that is effective through the end of the year. So while you may be operating at a reduced capacity and have had no incidents of leave use or limited incidents of leave use, employees are going to come back to work and this benefit is still going to be there. And there may be a lull over the course of the summer. I guess it goes away when it gets hot out, I heard. There might be a lull over the course of the summer and then it comes back later on and that leave is still going to be available. So you have to have the policies in place for administering and guidelines in place for eligibility of the paid leave benefits, and have the person who's in charge of responding to those requests and administering that benefit up to speed on eligibility requirements. In addition, we still have state FMLA and federal FMLA available for serious health conditions of the employees and their family members, assuming that the employee size threshold has been met. So an employee who exhausts their emergency paid leave for their own, their emergency paid sick leave for their own coronavirus treatment. They get, as Jim is going to talk about, they get 2 weeks of paid leave. They exhaust their FFCRA benefit. They still have federal and state FMLA if they're eligible and the employer is covered for a COVID-related job protected leave. So the point is there's an interplay between all of these leave criteria, and that they all need to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, and you need to fold the new FFCRA leave, which we're going to talk about in more detail, into your portfolio of leave policies, incorporate it as an addendum policy to your handbook, so the employees know that it's available to them, and there's a DOL notice that needs to be provided as well. So leave issues related to coronavirus, whether they qualify for protected leave or whether the employer is going to exercise discretion in being lax with an attendance policy or give additional unpaid leave, those are issues that are going to be around for the rest of the year. So again, policies drive the administration, and it's very critical that those be drafted and circulated. So talking now in a little bit more detail about this new Federal Paid Leave Act, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, I'm going to talk first about some general provisions that cover the two main paid leave benefits, those two being the expanded family medical leave and the emergency paid sick leave. There was also some unemployment eligibility criteria that was addressed, that's been addressed again in the subsequent CARES Act. There was some testing criteria that had been addressed, but really the two main takeaways for employers out of the FFCRA are the two types of paid leave that are available to employees now related to COVID-19. There are some general principles that apply for all employers under the FFCRA and apply equally to both types of benefits. The first is that the employer, for purposes of FFCRA, is all private sector employers with less than 500 employees and all public sector employers regardless of size. So state government, city municipalities are all covered. And again, all private sector employers with less than 500 employees. We fielded questions about employers who, with their parent and subsidiary companies combined, would be in excess of 500 employees. And does that mean that they're exempt from the FFCRA? And the answer depends on the integrated employer test. And what that looks at is to the extent that there is kind of common management and control. This is a fact-specific test that's evaluated and administered by the DOL at the federal level. Some of the criteria here is whether there's common management, whether the entity's operations are interrelated, so to the extent that they share building locations or personnel or equipment, to the extent that those things are shared, more likely to be deemed an integrated employer, and therefore the total number of employees will be used to count for purposes of FFCRA coverage. Whether there's centralized control of labor relations, is there a single HR department and a single team of management personnel that's overseeing all employees. And then the degree of common ownership and financial control over the entities. Again, all aspects, all elements, fact specific, but this is a roadmap to the extent that you're an employer or work for an employer that's on the cusp, has a subsidiary that, if included, would put them over 500 and might be an analysis worth going through in more detail. The other important thing to point out that is available for small businesses, those with less than 50 employees, there is an exemption to providing the expanded family medical leave for childcare, and as well as an exemption for the paid emergency sick leave for childcare, if providing that leave would threaten the viability of the business as a going concern. And that's the language in the Act. It doesn't make a ton of sense to me at first reading either, but we have gotten some DOL guidance on exactly what that means. And to read the language from the guidance, an employer may deny leave to those employees whose absence would cause the employer's expenses and financial obligations to exceed the available business revenue, pose a substantial risk, or prevent the small employer from operating at minimum capacity. So in reading the guidance, it's clear that this is a department by department or even employee by employee fact specific analysis. It isn't a question of, we have less than 50 employees, giving this leave would really put us in a bind, so we deem ourselves exempt. The evaluation, the analysis has to be more nuanced than that, and it has to be, again, specific to exactly how would this employee's absence or this absences in this department for lack of coverage from other employees, whatever the circumstances are, it's certainly, but the point is it has to be at that type of level. Now, there isn't a formal application process. The DOL has actually come out and said don't submit information, or excuse me, don't submit requests for exemption or to clarify the exemption. It simply states that the employer is to perform this evaluation and certify documents the basis that it feels it qualifies for the exemption, and retain that records to the extent that that decision is ever challenged at a later date. I've had one employer, I think, look at this, but to be honest, I haven't had many. Jim, have you had any, or Bill, clients go down this road in great detail?
Not yet, and not much detail. Questions about it, things like that, but I'm not aware of any formal application with that effort.
Right, same. The other exemption that Jim is going to talk about is the other exemption for paid leave eligibility is for healthcare providers and emergency responders.
Yeah, thanks, John. The healthcare provider exemption, and what we're talking about is these two new provisions, those dealing with the extended FMLA and then the new federal paid sick leave. There are certain positions that are exempt from it that don't get that, quite frankly. One is healthcare providers. That definition we already saw and had and has been adopted both in the regulations and other aspects, and that's the same definition we've been dealing with under FMLA before. So not a lot new with that. The more difficult one we were facing was emergency responder, because that didn't have the definition that healthcare provider had it before. And quite frankly, it's a lot broader than those might think. Originally, some of the thinking was the traditional fire, police, EMT was the typical emergency responder, but it's far broader than that. We anticipated it would be broader than that, and the regulations demonstrate that it's broader than that. Essentially, as broad as all of those necessary in dealing with this crisis and helping run your business. It's pretty broad as far as that goes. But again, look back to the regulations, and in a minute, we're going to talk about some references for you about that. You will have within your workforce, I'm sure you've seen this, some people that are emergency responders and or healthcare providers, and then some that are not. So you're going to have some people that are covered under the new provisions of the Act, some that are not. Another reason why policy is so important for dealing with those. Designate which positions fall within these exemptions to help you out and working ahead if you have not done that already. Better to deal with it now than before you get too many requests for those of you that are getting requests for this type of leave. In terms of the guidance that's available, a couple of things that we had put together for you. Of course, if there's a new federal law or state employment law, and assuming you've got room left on your wall, there's always going to be a new poster, and by God, there's a new poster for this too. And this site will get you to that new poster. Now, I'll have to tell you, there's already been a second version of this. So when you link, you want to make sure you get to the right link and hang in there, because although they didn't catch the first typo, they didn't catch the next typo on the poster that's out there. So look for another link that'll be coming later as they keep updating the poster. It is important though, and as much as I joke about the posters, there is a poster, you have to post the poster. Second aspect that's really helpful, there's new regulations, and you can get to those too, but there's a pretty good question and answers section that we reference in this link as well. That'll answer a lot of questions for you from the Department of Labor and good guidance. So that's where that link is there. On the next page is a picture of the poster to give you an idea what we've got with that. And again, that link earlier is going to get you right back to that. I make light of it, but make sure you've got that up and running.
So just to quickly take a little deeper dive into what these two main components of the FFCRA actually provide, the two main leave benefits. The first is the expanded family medical leave, and as the name implies, it's an expansion of existing FMLA. So if you are currently above 50 employees and working within and providing, administering FMLA, it's just a new eligibility criteria for people to access that leave. Now, a portion of it is paid, which is unique to the expanded FMLA, but you are familiar with the concept of FMLA, documenting usage, designating return to work. And it's important to point out that any FMLA usage for covered employers by eligible employees counts against the 12-week expanded FMLA benefit. So this isn't a new 12-week benefit. It's an alternative way for employees to access the 12-week FMLA benefit. So the alternative eligibility criteria, the definition of covered employer has changed. It used to be, or excuse me, traditional FMLA is employers with more than 50 employees. The expanded FMLA is available to anyone working for an employer with less than 500 employees. A covered employee under traditional FMLA has to have been employed for a year and worked at least 1,250 hours during that time. The covered employees for purposes of expanded family medical leave have to be employed for at least 30 days, and there's no hour requirement. So if you're a traditional FMLA covered employer, you're going to have employees that are not covered by either brand new employees. You're going to have employees that are covered by expanded FMLA, but not traditional FMLA. And you're going to have employees who have been there for over a year who are covered by both. So it's important when you again, integrate the expanded FMLA policy into your existing FMLA policies or into your existing leave policies, that you understand the interrelationship between this leave benefit and the others. And what exactly is expanded FMLA available for? It is job protected leave to provide needed care for a son or daughter under 18 because a school or place of care has been closed and childcare is no longer available. So obviously schools being closed for the rest of the school year, a number of employees have had to stay home to provide care for those employees. A number of daycare facilities have closed. As we get into summer, the law is written to say place of care. So the initial DOL guidance that we're seeing, and I anticipate it'll be updated as we get into the summer months, but place of care based on DOL guidance has been interpreted to include summer camps or whatever the typical summer child care arrangement is for your employees' children. If that is no longer available or if that is closed due to COVID-19, I anticipate that those employees will be eligible for expanded family medical leave. But it's important, the two primary elements of eligibility are that the child care facility, whether it's a school or daycare or place of care, is closed due to COVID-19, and that the employee is needed to provide child care, that there isn't an alternative child care arrangement available to them that they could utilize in lieu of taking the leave. Sorry, just glancing at the questions. I don't think we have any on, sorry. So the expanded family medical leave, it is a 12-week benefit. As I said, it's an alternative way to access the 12 weeks of family medical leave. The first 2 weeks or 10 work days is unpaid. The remaining 10 weeks is paid at 2/3 the employee's regular rate, and that's based on the number of hours the employee would normally be scheduled to work. And there's some calculations, some guidance on the calculations for employees that work variable schedules. If it's a part-time employee, you take their average number of hours worked over the prior 6 months to determine how many hours they would have worked but for the leave. But the point is that they are eligible for 2/3 the regular rate of pay for their normal regular work schedule, and that their daily benefit is capped at $200 per day. There is an option, the ability for the employer and the employee to agree on substitution of additional paid leave if they have a vacation bank or PTO, employer provided leave. They want to substitute 1/3 of that leave to make themselves whole during the expanded FMLA period. That is permissible. The guidance indicates that employers and employees have pretty broad discretion to work out whether it's intermittent leave usage or substitution of paid leave to make up differences in pay. The DOL has provided discretion and broad discretion for an employee and employer to work out an arrangement that works out for both of them with those issues. The other important point is the verification of need, and it's interesting, we're getting DOL guidance on the administration and eligibility, and then we're getting IRS guidance on what type of paperwork you're supposed to have and employers are required to maintain in order to verify that the employees that are being provided this leave are in fact eligible. The IRS guidance, and again talking about the expanded family medical leave, which is only limited to child care due to place of care closure, the documentation or the information that the employers are instructed to maintain includes the name and ages of the children to be cared for, the name of the school or daycare that's unavailable, a representation that no other caretaker is available, and this goes to, again, to the employee verifying that they are needed to provide child care, and then identifying a special circumstance if the employee, or excuse me, the employee is indicating they are needed to provide child care for a child over the age of 14. The guidance doesn't really go much further than that. What special circumstances qualify? However, the guidance, my reading, indicates that employers are permitted to ask follow-up questions if an employee asks for expanded family medical leave to care for a 17, 16-year-old child who presumably would be fine absent their care. Why exactly is the employee needed to provide care for that child? And again, I haven't seen guidance more detailed than that. I haven't had employers challenge or question employees. Jim or Bill, feel free to weigh in. But I think the DOL is just providing employers, permitting employers to ask those follow-up questions if circumstances deem necessary. And a little bit more about the emergency paid sick leave. Jim will talk about that.
If we go to the second piece of the law, the other benefits that's there is the 80 hours from a full-time standpoint of federal paid leave. It's kind of a big deal in the sense that it's a federal required paid leave act. And as John said earlier, it's going to end. It has an end date, but stay tuned to that. Let's see. There's a lot of lobby interests, of course, that would like to see some of this extended. For now, it's limited. 80 hours for a full-time person. If your full-time person is 37.5 hours, that doesn't mean they're going to get a windfall of 80 hours. That means if they're working 40 hours a week, they're going to get 80 in the 2-week period, but they're only going to get 75 on the prorated basis, even if you call them full-time if they work 37.5. That comes through guidance from the DOL. Part-time people on a prorated basis and formulas for figuring that out. The employee chooses, similar to some of the other FMLA guidance and other things we've seen in the past. We can't say you've got this 2 weeks, you got to use that first, got to burn this. They may say I want it, they may say I don't, but they're going to have a right in that. As we said, there's always there already are those exclusions of the healthcare workers and the emergency responders, and as we already talked about, there's also provisions for those with 50 or less to ask. Unlike the extended FMLA that John talked about earlier, there are 6 reasons where somebody can qualify, and they're listed within this PowerPoint as far as that goes. And you'll note that most of them are going to relate to something related to COVID-19, of people either being subject to an order because of it, or they're advised by a healthcare provider because of it. They've got symptoms because of it, but again, seeking medical diagnosis, or they're caring for somebody. Note that the first 3 of those are paid at 100%. After that, and they all relate to the employee, the employee. When I get to number 4, we're dealing with somebody caring for somebody else. Note that the pay is 2/3 of the pay that would apply. When I get to reason number 5, you're going to note that in regards to that, it's exactly the same reason John talked about. The one reason somebody can qualify for the extended FMLA also applies here. To pick up on the guidance John was talking about, there is some discussion that talks about what does it mean to say for the need to care? If both spouses are off and both spouses are available, guidance is saying that may not demonstrate a need for somebody to be off. So that's why you can ask a little bit more of that. The fact that school is closed, they're all closed. The fact that daycare may not be available, a lot of that is not available, doesn't automatically qualify people for that. And then there's the sixth reason is experience conditions described, and quite frankly, they've told us they haven't given us guidance on this last one as to what falls into some of these categories, so we'll have to stay tuned for reason number 6. The rest of it kind of covers. Same time, there's capped amounts that apply to all of those kind of things. With that, I would turn it over to Bill to talk a little bit about the PPP program.
Thanks, Jim. When I started working on this slide, I thought that it would be relatively simple to take the current rules that most of you saw if you did a PPP loan and go through a summary. However, I think after the last couple days even, you should change the name on the slide, the title on the slide, to "If it's too good to be true, it probably is." There is now a significant effort on the part of the government to take a look at the fact that, you know, all of these PPP loans were made, and kind of looking back and saying, okay, did the proper people, proper businesses get this money? And if not, what are we going to do about it? Currently there is a trend toward looking at the certification that anybody that made a PPP loan made, and that certification was that the uncertainty of the current economic conditions makes necessary the loan request to support ongoing operations of the eligible recipient. There is a deadline of May 7th to return the money without any penalty. So if you can't meet that certification, as some of the publicly traded companies could not, they gave their money back. Government has said you don't have to worry, you'll be forgiven if you give the money back by May 7th. So what does that mean? What does that certification mean? You know, read alone, that certification can be read in a variety of ways. One hand, the U.S. economy is facing an unprecedented pandemic. Even for a stable company, maintaining ongoing operations has transitioned what they normally have as day-to-day concerns. I mean, how many times have you heard on TV the statement, "in these uncertain times"? Well, does that mean that then every business could meet that certification? On the other hand, many companies have access to capital and could use that capital to support themselves during this time. So where do you lie? At this time, we can't say. The rules are changing, even to the extent that there was a recent article by Ron Johnson that suggests changing the forgiveness rules even after the fact, which they can do. I think that the key to your company should be, did you thrive during this period of time? Generally, if you thrive during this period of time, you probably don't meet the first certification and should take a very serious look before May 7th at whether or not you can meet that requirement. For us as attorneys, the complication is we don't have rules that we can go back to. The SBA generally gives loans only as a debt of last resort. However, under the PPP program, the restrictions that made the SBA loans were waived. Presumably, the federal government then wanted to deploy dollars to a much broader category of business than the typical SBA programs. The only restriction associated with the program is the necessity certification. So applicants were left and are still left without clear guidance in determining whether to make the necessity certification in good faith. The SBA guidance that was just recently issued, you've probably heard the Shake Shack situation. So there was some SBA guidance that came out after the fact that dealt with publicly traded companies, or specifically mentioned publicly traded companies, but the analysis used in that guidance could be equally applicable to privately held companies. So while a lot of businesses have been very concerned about how do I obtain my loan forgiveness, the first analysis should be done to say, okay, could I make the necessity certification? Because if I can't, then there could possibly be criminal violations that go along with it, which are much more serious than whether or not the loan is forgiven. We can say with some certainty now, the PPP loans are going to be audited and borrowers may face enforcement scrutiny. Main areas of risk include necessity for the loan, size eligibility, the amount of the loan requested, and the use of the loan proceeds. So what are the proper use of the loan proceeds? Well, keep in mind that the use of the proceeds, that by definition, is much broader than the forgiveness limitations. So I've given some examples on the slide of uses for an SBA 7A loan. Includes much more than, as I indicated, much more than that. So you have a loan. Now you get a 1% loan for 2 years. It's not a horrible situation, even if you don't get the forgiveness, which I do believe is going to be subject to additional limitations. So what do you need to do? You need to, first of all, I believe, keep a separate account. The money that you received on the loan should have been placed in a separate account so that you can track the uses of the funds. You as a borrower will need to document the purposes for which the loan was spent and provide detailed accounting in order to obtain that loan forgiveness. Entities must track where the directed money was spent. They have to keep their employee counts, and they have to keep compensation levels, all records on compensation levels. You have to maintain receipts and logs in the moment. Don't try to create them after the fact. After the fact, records are always viewed with some level of scrutiny by enforcement entities. It will also help you when it comes to not only the audit, but the other types of verifications that John and Jim spoke about before. Now, how do you maximize the loan forgiveness? Assuming that you got through the necessity certification. Limit the use of those proceeds. Now, payroll costs and benefits, mortgage interest, rent, and utilities. There will be additional information coming out on uses. Maintain the 75% payroll requirement, maintain that employee headcount and compensation levels during this 8-week period. The program itself lays out specific costs that are legitimately considered to be payroll. Per employee payroll may not exceed $100,000. Payroll costs can include costs of employee vacation, parental and family, medical leave, sick leave. There's a question as to whether you can bonus out part of the payroll loan proceeds. So that information is forthcoming. The payroll cost must relate to US-based employees, not foreign employees. We need to watch for the updates. I think that in reading Ron Johnson's article, at the end, he indicates, he goes through some limitations. One limitation would be that if this is a proposed limitation, that if the company made money, the loan would not be forgiven. in 2020. But in summarizing, he says, making these limitations on forgiveness retroactive may seem unfair, but businesses and nonprofit organizations that didn't need the program shouldn't be rewarded with loan forgiveness for taking advantage of it. That abuse should be remedied, and doing so will help the individuals and entities that have borne the brunt of the coronavirus's economic destruction. So in the end, I think that keeping the records current, keeping your records separate, identifying it are going to be key features when you do inevitably get questions from your lender that says you need to prove up your forgiveness, if forgiveness is an issue for you.
So I've been monitoring the chat. I don't think I've missed any questions. If I have, please resubmit. We're happy to take any questions you have on anything we've talked about. But to utilize our last 5 minutes here, we do have some common questions going back to the FFCRA paid leave benefits and just some general concerns that employers are having during this time. We'll go through those, and again, I'll keep watching the chat if anyone has additional questions. So the first is, our employee is concerned he could catch coronavirus and wants to stay home, and they want to be paid. So that this is an issue that a lot of employers have been struggling with. A lot of employees are working from home or are not working at all. So the employees that are being expected to come into a facility, particularly retail or where customer-facing positions, they've been met with some reluctance from people who are scared for their safety. Unless the employee is eligible for some form of job-protected leave, it is permissible for employers to enforce their attendance policies and require employees come to work subject to discipline if they do not. Now, is there any job-protected leave for someone just being scared to come to work? The answer is no, absent a medical certification from a doctor that this is a vulnerable individual who's been instructed to isolate due to the risk of exposure to them. That would likely qualify for the emergency paid sick leave. But someone who is otherwise healthy and just doesn't feel comfortable being out in public or doesn't want to be around their coworkers, that is not a legitimate basis for refusing to come into work.
And if we picked up another question along those lines of, let's talk about the employee that's experiencing symptoms and you see that and they'd really like to be at work, not unlike prior situations that you may have had, you are going to have some leeway, and even more now than we may have had before, to say we can't have people at work under certain conditions for all of the reasons we know about with this epidemic and pandemic. And we may require that people be off and gone for a certain amount of time, and they may or may not qualify for the emergency paid sick leave or the other benefits that you have available, depending upon the circumstances. Let's keep this in mind. The more that there's medical information or medical certification, the better off you are in making your decisions. But yes, you're going to be able to do some of those things.
The next question, do I have to continue benefits while the employee is off of work? While they're off on FFCRA, either expanded family medical leave or emergency paid sick leave, the answer is yes. If someone is off for a longer period of time, either a furlough or a layoff, the policy is going to dictate. We've seen back at the end of March when Safer at Home was just going into effect and a lot of employers were making those staffing adjustments, we saw a number of insurers adjusting the hourly work requirement for eligible employees so they could remain covered. So we are seeing some flexibility on those coverage issues, but again, that would be dictated and controlled by the policy when we're talking about an employee who's going to be unscheduled, i.e. furloughed, or laid off for a period of time.
Mentioned earlier a scenario where minor child, 17's at home, but here we have a 17-year-old who's in high school. I'm going to stay home. They need my help at home. I've had a couple 17-year-olds, and is that really the case? And you're verifying that might be that they qualify, but just because they're 17 and just because school is closed, again, as we talked about before, doesn't necessarily mean that there's the need for care. Not necessarily given. Take a look at each fact scenario.
The next one, you direct an employee not to come to work because of their travel. Are they eligible for emergency paid sick leave? Unless they are experiencing symptoms and seeking treatment. Someone who, you have a policy that says report travel, you have a policy that says anyone who travels is going to be expected to remain off of work for X number of days and not return until they're symptom free for X number of days. We've seen a lot of policies crafted in that nature. If you are administering that policy, someone travels and they aren't allowed to return to work, but they aren't experiencing symptoms, they aren't seeking treatment, they aren't caring for someone else who's been exposed to or diagnosed with COVID-19, then they would not be eligible for the emergency paid sick leave. They could use the employer provided leave to the extent that they have any available to them and it's permissible under your policies. But again, absent symptoms and treatment, they would not be eligible for the emergency paid sick leave.
Another question is in pre-employment and hiring people, and we do drug testing, but the drug testing site is closed or quite frankly overwhelmed right now with all of the other medical issues going on, and we're actually being asked to step back from doing some of those kind of things. Can we move back that time period for making the conditional offer? I'm sure you're going to have to be able to do some of those kind of things. And subject again to the test that you can do it when. There are times that now the hiring date that we're thinking of bringing somebody in, we may do a conditional offer, and that might not be for 3-4 weeks that we can't bring the people in. So there are modifications to typical things we used to do before. This is one of them.
Well, that's everything we have. I don't see any questions, Mickey, so I think we've answered everything they could possibly want to know on this topic, I think.
Kind of sounds like it. We did run over a few minutes, so I'm just going to close out. And if you do have questions, I'm sure they will stay on and answer any that you have. But thank you to Bill, John, and Jim. We truly appreciate taking the time to do this presentation. You can find information about our upcoming webinars on our website under events. And just want to say thank you all for attending and have a great rest of your day. Again, if you'd like to stay on and ask questions, I am sure they will be available to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I have a question.
Sure.
Go ahead, Amy.
Oh, okay. So with the, so I applied for PPP and I'm a sole proprietorship and I'm a single employee and I do an owner's draw, and the first round of PPP, but the second round of PPP, the owner's draw, sole proprietorships was allowed into that fund. So what is my, so I never did a payroll for myself because it's just me. And so for reporting on the reporting, what would I have to, would I just do the same kind of proof where I have my business account and I would just do an owner's draw into my personal account? Would that be the proof? Because that's what I did in the past for the owner's draw because it's just me. Is that the kind of proof that I have to show them, 6 months from now?
I think so. As the rules become more tailored to specific instances, I think your situation where you're a sole proprietor, a single owner, and the money is transferred from your business account to your individual account, that's a pretty easy thing to track. And so, but what you don't want to do is, I don't think that you want to take it all at one time in the first week. Okay. The easiest way to do it would be to move 1/8 of the money every week into your personal account.
Okay.
Owner's account, because that makes it appear as though it's the same as any other payroll and it looks the same. My concern is kind of like in the construction world, the theft by contractor, where the contractor is supposed to hold the money in a separate account, but they don't. What the analysis always is did you go negative and use the money for some other purpose? This way,
Okay.
you keep that money in the account, you show that there's a positive balance, didn't use it for something else and take it out on a weekly basis. I think you'll be safe because that'll meet normal payroll.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I think that might be it. Thank you,
right.
guys.
All right, you're welcome.
All
Have a
right.
good
You're
day.
welcome. Have a
Have a good day.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.